Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming to you once again from our Blue Ridge studio in the mountains of North Carolina. But we're also broadcasting through the radio platform of Rejoice Radio in Glenn County, Georgia, where I have a home, and also on the television platform of the St. Stephen's Church of Louisville, Kentucky, where I have spent a good bit of my life. The best way to join us is to listen through a radio link on the homepage of the meetinghouse.net, which is our website, or you can go to Facebook to the meetinghouse.net page, the meetinghouse.net page on Facebook, and you can watch this live as we broadcast it. As always, today I've got 5 news stories brought to you by Perfecto Coffee Inc. of California. At the end of the news, I hope to have my commentary entitled, "I'm Ready for Easter." I'd better be ready because I'm preaching a sermon this weekend at the First Baptist Church of Carlisle, Kentucky, where I have preached a number of times in the past, and maybe we can talk about that later, because my guest today is also a reverend, also a pastor, I assume preaching also on this Sunday morning, Dr. Ryan Burge. I've never met him face-to-face. Ryan, great. Welcome to the Meetinghouse today.
Hey, I am preaching tomorrow on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday. It's going to be exciting.
So what is your text for this Sunday morning, preacher?
We're going to use, I'm a big fan of the end of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 16. You know, there's the shorter ending and there's a longer ending. And I like that shorter ending because it ends with the women they see Jesus and the angel tells them to go tell everyone what they'd seen. And they said, and they told nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
They were afraid.
That's the last word in the gospel right there is a word of afraid, which I think is no more relevant at any time than right now with everything that's going on in the world. I think fear is holding many people back from being who God called them to be. So that's what we're going to talk about.
Well, I actually quote that text in my commentary today, and if we have time and I get to that, otherwise people can read it at the meetinghouse.net. I am preaching from the 20th chapter of the Gospel of John, the story about the 2 disciples running to the tomb. That's my text. We're going to talk about Dr. Burge's book, The Nuns, where they come from, who they are, and where they are going. It's hot off the press. I've read it and reviewed it. That's also on the website. But if you'll stay tuned to the program today and listen or watch, the good doctor and I are going to talk about not only his book, but his wide-ranging awareness and knowledge of what's going on in religion in America, and it is fascinating. So, but first we're going to start with these news stories and talk about them one by one. From Los Angeles, California, Steven Spielberg, a noted filmmaker, of course, has been awarded this year's Genesis Prize, recognizing his accomplishments, contributions to humanity, and commitment to Jewish values. Spielberg and his wife, Kate Capshaw, have added another $1 million to that prize money to create grants totaling $2 million that they're giving to nonprofit organizations addressing a wide range of social justice issues. The Genesis Prize is awarded annually to Jewish people who have achieved significant professional success. The prize was founded in 2012 with a $100 million endowment from 5 Russian philanthropists. Very interesting. Dr. Burge, have you ever heard of the Genesis Prize?
I haven't, but I'm very familiar with Steven Spielberg, obviously. I mean, his films are probably some of the best films of my lifetime. But you know what, I've actually preached about, his work a little bit before that, in the 90s, after Schindler's List came out, he became acutely aware of the Holocaust survivors were dying off rapidly. And he wanted to make sure that there was a living record of the things that they went through. And so he spent a lot of his own money doing video interviews with hundreds of these survivors of places like Auschwitz so that we could have a historical document of what they went through so that we would never forget. And I'm always impressed by his ability to think long term, not just make movies for, to make lots of money, which he's done, but also to use his platform and his money to, benefit humanity. So he's a very worthy recipient in my mind.
I agree with you 100%. He's been very influential on many fronts, and I'm glad to see him honored in this way, and I'm glad to see him distribute the money in this way. Mm-hmm. From Nashville, Tennessee, popular country singer Carrie Underwood has released her first totally religious album entitled My Savior. It contains 13 songs drawn mainly from her heritage growing up in an evangelical Christian home in Oklahoma. Songs familiar to me, and I assume to you also, Ryan. Songs such as How Great Thou Art, Because He Lives, Jesus Loves Me, and Softly and Tenderly. There's 4 of them that are on that disc. Underwood rose to fame as the winner of the 2005 competition American Idol and has sustained a successful singing career since then. She is worth an estimated $200 million. Ryan, are you a fan of country music?
No, but I'm a fan of old school hymns. I know that puts me in a minority group amongst my age range of folks, but I went to a college where they had a contemporary Christian music major, so it was a lot of the praise and worship music, but I really I like I grew up Southern Baptist, singing Because He Lives and the old rugged cross and In the Garden and, Just As I Am. But the hymns I really love right now are things like Be Thou My Vision. I love that one. Mm-hmm. Blessed Assurance is a good one. There's so many good hymns. I think that it's nice to see these country stars going back to the old stuff and kind of reimagining it for a new generation.
Well, I agree with you 100%. I'm sitting here in my studio looking at my piano, and I frequently sit down and play a lot of the hymns out of the old hymn books. And like you, my spirituality was formed by these old gospel songs. I do listen to some country music, but I'm a recent convert to John Prine. I don't know whether he qualifies as a country star. It's folk and traditional music, but he is so unique. Next week is the 1-year anniversary of his death. He died at the age of 73 by COVID, and I'm going to do a show honoring him. I've already done one show this year, but that's going to be the focus of my show. My guests are Birmingham pastor and songwriter and performer Gary Furr, a longtime personal friend, and another personal friend, Nashville singer, songwriter, and preacher's kid, Kate Campbell. They will be on the show next week, and we'll talk about John Prine. From Brunswick, Georgia, which is where I live, keep your eye out for Ken Nealon. He might be dragging across the main street of your own town like he did in mine this past week. He started the current trek in Key West and is headed for New York City. He hopes to be there by July. At age 81, Ken had lived a full life of adventure before a conversion to Roman Catholic Christianity. Professional baseball player, bank robber, book writer, screen script writer. He's done a little bit of everything, and now his first walk from Savannah, Georgia to San Francisco, all the way across the country. Somebody asked him, "What is your message?" And he replied, "Love one another." Ryan, my home is on St. Simon Island, Georgia. I did not see this man. I read about it in the newspaper down there, but he reminds me of Arthur Blessitt. Does that name ring a bell with you?
I had to look him up, but I do remember seeing a picture of the guy he had a wheel on the bottom of that cross. That's how I remember most of it. I was always thinking like dragging your cross hundreds of miles a day sounds awful. Putting a wheel on the bottom of it makes it a little bit easier, but still not something I would want to spend, months doing.
Well, Ken Nealon has wheels at the bottom of his cross. Mm-hmm. It does make it easier, but it's still a tough task he's laid out from Key West all the way up to New York City. From Los Angeles again, the Gallup Research Organization reports that for the first time, membership in a worshiping community has dropped below 50% of the American population. That includes people connected with a church, synagogue, mosque, temple, or other form of assembly. For most of the 20th century, that number stayed right around 70%, but in the 1990s began to decline. This means that because 3/4 of the population claim a religious preference, fully a third of these believers are not connected to a worshiping community. Ryan, this is what we're going to talk about today. You've done a lot of research on this.
Yeah, and actually, I'm really grateful for Gallup to release this result right now, because it's actually boosted my book sales pretty significantly, which I'm thankful for. But I think that this is an interesting, not to go too far into the methods of things, but I think the question they ask is really interesting, which is that, are you a member of a church? And that member word is a really tricky word when it comes to, religion in the 21st century. Gallup's been asking this question for, literally since the 1930s now, which I think it made a lot more sense in the 1930s because membership and religion went together. But today, a lot of people, are religious, but they're not members of any congregation.
Well, but on the flip side, there are millions of members who have lost all contact with their church of which they're a member.
That's true. Southern Baptists never purge the rolls, it seems
they
like.
Don't. And there are many, many people that grew up in a church, got baptized, joined the church, confirmed, and have dropped out, long since dropped out. And I'm going to come back and talk to you more about this later. Finally, everywhere, it's festival time. Last week, Jews celebrated Passover. This week, Christians observe Holy Week, Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday. And in about a week, Muslims will begin their annual celebration of Ramadan, scheduled for the month beginning April 12th and ending May 11th. All of these are coming just as the global pandemic is, well, I want to say winding down. Maybe it is and maybe it isn't. Like I said earlier, I'll be celebrating Easter in Carlisle, Kentucky with family and friends, and I'll be preaching there. That text from the 20th chapter of John, my gospel sidekick, Samuel Wyatt Curson, 12-year-old grandson from Charlotte, North Carolina, will be with me reading that story before I preach. That's all the news, sponsored by Perfecto Coffee of California. This is a young company started last year by two former students of mine at Georgetown College. And I like their coffee, and I'm encouraging you to go online, perfectocoffeeinc.com, and order some of their coffee. It would make a great gift. I'm going to send a package of this, Ryan, to you.
Excellent.
Put that order in the mail today.
Wonderful.
I'll be back in just a minute. This is the Meetinghouse. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. With me in the Meetinghouse today is Dr. Ryan Burge. We're going to talk about his book. Dr. Burge is the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, Illinois, but he's also assistant professor at Eastern Illinois University with a PhD in political science and a specialty in religious life in America, which is exactly the theme of our own show here. Ryan, this is your new book. Tell us in just a few words, who are the nuns, spelled N-O-N-E-S? Who are they?
So it's three different groups of people. It's people who on a survey say they're atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Combined, those three groups make up about 30% of the population, which is up significantly from where they were just 10 years ago. I mean, in the 1970s, they were only 5% of America, and now they're 30% of America. They're the fastest growing religious group in America today.
There are so many questions that come to my mind as I read your book, as I listened to you talk, but I want to help our listeners first. I had to get educated as I read your book. Tell us the sources from which you get your data.
Yeah, so two different surveys I use in the book and I use extensively in my work. One is called the General Social Survey, which has it's been done basically biannually since 1972. It's considered to be the gold standard sociological survey in amongst folks who do what I do. The other is what's called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, which began in 2006. And the data for that, the 2020 wave, just came out last Friday. It's the benefit of that survey is it's a lot larger. The GSS is around 2,000 people per year. The CCS was 61,000 people last year. So we get a lot more specificity in those bigger samples.
Now, in questioning like this, do they question people through social media or the phone or face-to-face or what? How do they gather this information?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The General Social Survey is done face-to-face, or it was until 2020 came around, and then they switched it. But traditionally, 46 years worth, it's been done in a face-to-face, sort of very traditional survey style, where you actually, know the person asking you questions. They hand you pieces of paper and, for response options, things like that. The CCES is all done online, though, and that's the move that most every polling house has made over the last couple of years, realizing that online, as internet access has become more widespread and been adopted by people of every age range, every income bracket, it's become much easier, cheaper, and better. The data is actually better now doing online surveys than doing face-to-face or phone surveys. And so people are on panels. So you get recruited to be on a panel. And then if you're on a panel and they're looking for someone that you meet the description of, then they'll contact you to do a survey and you get paid a small amount to complete that survey. That's really how most surveys are being done today.
So if I sign up to do one of these, that is to help administer the survey, do they give me a certain region to cover or names that I'm supposed to call, or am I just supposed to find my own people?
No, so the administrators are all trained social scientists, right? So it's not just a volunteer, but to be the person being asked the question. So they have what are called stables of panelists, that they have like 100,000 people in a stable, let's say, and they'll say, okay, we need to have 500 women and 500 men for our survey. So they'll randomly draw out of those 100,000 people 500 women and 500 men, knowing that those people are responsive to surveys and will take that survey and get paid for it. So that's really the way that it used to be what's called random digit dialing, which is basically they would just have the phone call a random phone number, which worked really well until people got cell phones and stopped answering the phone. And so now, like, response rates for phone surveys are around 2%.
Right.
So you got to think to get one response, you have to do 50 phone calls. To do 1,000 person survey, it takes 50,000 phone calls. So like that whole thing becomes so inefficient. The problem is too, who answers the phone anymore? It's typically not a random sample of America like it used to be. So that's why we moved to those online panel designs. And almost every survey now is using that online panel style because it's cheaper. And the data quality is actually better using those new styles than the old style now, at least.
So it's coming through social media. You mean like an email?
Yeah, so they'll recruit you saying, would you like to be on, let's say, a panel for the Qualtrics is the company that I use a lot.
And by the word panel, you mean a group of people who are going to answer the questions.
Or potentially could be contacted in the future to answer questions.
I see, right.
Right. So then they basically have a list. It's like they have a Rolodex of people who can take your survey. And that way they don't have to go randomly out searching for people. So they're constantly recruiting for these panels. And then if you're on a panel, you might get contacted for a survey. You might not. Just depends on what they're looking for. But it just makes it easier to narrow everything down.
And you think this gives a representative slice? There are a lot of people who would never want to be on a panel and never want to talk to anybody. There are still a lot of people that don't have access to social media things. You think even with these large groups of people, they're still getting a good sample?
Yeah. So Pew's actually done work on this where they compared doing it the old way, which is the phone calls, to the new way, which is the online panels. And they actually find that the online panels are actually more accurate than the phone calls. And Pew, which is sort of the gold standard of survey firms in America today, does almost all their polling now using their online panel setup. And they've done this with deliberation over a long period of time. This hasn't been something you just decide to put the switch on, because like we talked about, the problem is to do it the old way with phone calls, you might get 2% response rate, but what happens if it's only men or only women or only older people or only white people or only educated people, right? So even then, doing it the old way actually biases it more now than it did 30 years ago. So sticking with the old method is actually worse given the circumstances that we're in, that no one answers their phone anymore.
Now, let me go back to Gallup and ask you this question. I reported that Gallup has issued this report about church membership. Do they have their own independent data, or are they using the same data that these other groups are using?
No, Gallup has their own independent data. That George Gallup was really the first pollster in America. That's kind of his claim to fame. Started doing it in 1936, did the first poll ever in the country. And so they have most of these survey firms like Pew, like Gallup, like Barna, if you're into the, the evangelical pollster, they all have what are called proprietary data, which means they collect it all on their own. They keep it on their own servers. They don't share it with the general public. They just share the findings. They don't actually share the raw survey data with hardly anyone, because that's sort of like their currency. Data has become money in the 21st century. Right. So, having a collection of survey data that no one else has really puts you in a very unique spot. So, no, Gallup has been asking these questions and keeping the data themselves for 70 years now.
Do they sell their data, Gallup?
No, there's no real reason. I don't think they ever would find a reason to do that, because then it's sort of, they lose their niche of the market, right? Which is data from 1940s. Like literally no one has religion data from the 1940s except Gallup. You can't find it. It doesn't exist. So they really have the market corner there.
Let's go back to this notion of the nones. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in the Nones. Now, I have 3 children. Like many people their age, my children grew up in church, morning, noon, and night. I was a pastor, of course, but now they are only casually connected to the church. All of them would be still formally the member of some church. They would identify as Christian, but not connected to a congregation. Do they qualify as a none?
That's a good question. It comes down to, if they were asked on a survey, what's your present religion, of any? If they said no religion, then they would be a none.
But if they said Christian,
they would not be a none. Nope, they would be a Christian.
And is there a way on any of these surveys do you all track the people who say they are Christian, but are not connected with any organization, church, mosque, temple, whatever?
We do ask if they attend, or their frequency of attendance. Yeah. Right. So that kind of helps connect people. But we know that, so if you think about, we think about religion in 3 ways. There's 3 sort of dimensions to religiosity. There's religious belonging, which is what we talked about. What's your present religion, of any, right? So that's like, what social group are you a part of? Right. There's religious behavior, which is almost always measured through church attendance. How often do you attend church outside of weddings and funerals? And then the third one is called belief, which is, what do you believe about God? And then, do you believe in God without any doubts, or do you not believe in God at all? And there's sort of a range of options you're given there. What we know is that most people, the first thing to go for most people is the religious behavior piece. They stop going to church before they stop doing anything else. About 35-40% of Americans never go. And then the second thing to go is religious belonging, which is the thing where you say you have no religious affiliation. And then the last of the 3, the one that kind of is the most stubborn, I guess you could say, is religious belief. And that only about 11% of Americans, even today, say they have an atheist or agnostic belief in God. So, 90% of Americans still have a belief in God, despite the fact that 40% of them never go to church and 25% say they have no religious affiliation.
I want to go back to your definition of behavior.
Yeah.
As a theologian, I distinguish between behavior as something that people do after they leave church, and practice. That is, the things that Christians or Muslims or any religious group does when they gather. So singing, for instance, or receiving an offering would be a Christian practice, something that they do collectively in a worship service, as we will Sunday on Easter. But behavior, things like telling the truth or keeping promises or refraining from stealing, the things that are governed by, let's say, the 10 Commandments, these are things people do in their wider social life. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, I guess from a social science perspective, we're more interested in attendance, because attendance leads to exposure to ideas and people, right? So, if you are like, let's say you're attending an evangelical church, the more you attend, the more exposure you're going to get to evangelical theology or conservative political ideology, being in one of those churches. So we're interested in attendance becomes a proxy for how attached you are to that thing, right? So let's say you're Catholic, but you go to church once a year. That's something different than being Catholic and going to church, going to mass 3 or 4 times a week. We think that you're probably going to be more attached to the Catholic tradition the more often you go. So we use attendance as sort of a proxy for, intensity of that attachment that you have.
Yes, but you can see the point I'm trying to make, that one of the purposes of all religions is to shape how people actually live, not what they do in the sanctuary, but what they do when they leave the sanctuary. And let's just say I had an interview some months ago with a recent convert to Catholicism, and she talks about the hard rules of Catholicism, and we talked about one in particular, not using contraception as one of the rules of behavior. That's something that is intended to define a Catholic, although it's something that doesn't happen in the sanctuary. And so the question becomes, is attending a mass and hearing a homily more constitutive of Catholicism, or is refraining from the use of contraception or telling the truth or any of these other things that isn't designed to shape behavior, shape the way we actually live life? That's the distinction I'm trying to make. And I know it doesn't fit. I want to go back to something you talk about in your book, and you just alluded to a minute ago. You trace the change from the slow growth of the nuns to dramatic growth of the nuns to something that happened in the 1990s. I want you to describe that, talk about it, and let's talk about what was it that happened in America that created what you all call the hockey stick line.
Yeah. So that's a good description. The hockey stick is, if you see the graph, it's just flat from 1972 to about 1990 or so. And then it just, boom, shoots up into the right, in a pretty steep incline from that point forward. The nuns only grew 2% in 20 years from 1972 to 1990, basically. So really slow growth, and then really quick growth from that point forward. They're growing 1 or 2% every year from that point forward, And really, I think there was a confluence of events that happened in America in the early 1990s that it's sort of easy to overlook if you weren't really a student of history. And so in 1990, for instance, the Summer of Mercy happened, which was this sort of nationwide movement, anti-abortion movement in this country. Anti-abortion is a modern political movement. In the 1970s, even the Southern Baptists were fairly moderate on the issue of abortion. Right. It sort of got activated by the Catholic Church. And there's plenty of evidence now from historians who say that evangelicals basically co-opted that piece of Catholic theology and sort of adopted it as their own in terms of pro-life views. Right. So that really kicked off a lot of changes in America. So in 1994, we had the Contract with America and Newt Gingrich, who, most political historians say he defined a new era in American politics, which was much more bruising and oppositional and critical of the other side. It used to be politicians basically got along. They had different policies, but they didn't hate each other. And Newt Gingrich was much more like he was willing to make enemies of the other side to get his agenda passed. And he was very successful at that. 1994, the Contract with America, Republicans took over the House, won 75 seats in the midterms. And the other thing that was going on in 1993, evangelicalism hit its peak in America at 30% of the population was evangelical. It's only 22% today. So even religion became more intense in the early 1990s. And if you think about it, that's right before the internet really became mainstream. Right. So televangelism really hit its peak influence in America in the late 80s and early 90s. So you had guys like Jim Bakker, guys like Jerry Falwell, guys like Pat Robertson, who were sort of all consumed with this, right-wing sort of theology and right-wing conservative political ideology. And I think what happened was a lot of moderate Christians who could hang out and be comfortable in a lot of denominations before that, now we're, faced with a lot of pro-life messaging and a lot of pro-Republican messaging. And that drove, I think, a lot of moderate Protestants out of these churches and into the arms of the nuns during that early 1990s period. And then it just built on itself. The more people that came, became nuns, it became easier for the next wave to become nuns. And now it just continued, that graph has just accelerated in the last 20 years.
One of the most interesting statistics in your book, you say that in 1972, half of the practicing Christians who were attending church were Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And today, only 25% of practicing Christians are Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the scenario that you have just described has really pushed a lot of more progressive and moderate people out of the church. Is that what you're contending?
Yeah, and I think that's actually what you see in the data, because the group that's really seen the biggest decline is what are called mainline Protestants. And those are people like United Methodists, Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, American Baptists, which is what I am. They were 30% of America in 1976. And today they're 10% of America. I mean, that's 1 in 5 Americans are not mainline Protestant anymore. And I think for a lot of them, they felt like, I can handle this church when it was just what we were doing, but now I'm getting painted as being a Falwell, being a Robertson, being this far right, which I don't really believe anyway. And by the way, a lot of them didn't believe it in the first place. They were not really attached to religion in the first place. It just kind of nudged them out over time, especially if politics became more bruising and more polarized. It just became easier to walk away from Christianity because you feel like Christianity didn't speak for moderates or liberals, political liberals anymore. And the nuns did.
Yes. And of course, you and I both grew up as Southern Baptists. We both have left it for more progressive Baptist networks. I'm in the Cooperative Baptist. You're in the American Baptist. Mm-hmm. And the people that I am around are people who are coming out of the evangelical world, either into a progressive or what we might call a mainline tradition, or they're just leaving organized religion entirely. Mm-hmm. But much of it is with this kind of confession. Well, if that's what it means to be a Christian, that is this culture war, Jerry Falwell, moral majority, March attack on the Capitol. If that's what it means to be a Christian, count me out. Mm-hmm. And I hear this a lot. I had breakfast with a good friend, a minister, and he was on the verge of that himself just this week. And so I do think that all this politicalization, sometimes I think, you talked about Newt Gingrich and his willingness to see a political opponent as an enemy, that this comes out of the vocabulary that was introduced into the evangelical world principally by Jerry Falwell when he launched what was called the culture war. I don't know who came up with that phrase, but when you begin to frame everything as a war and use battle language, then your opponent becomes not just another citizen who has a different opinion, but they become the enemy that needs to be destroyed. And I feel like that has characterized so much of my adult life, not only in the denomination, the Southern Baptists, where they were out to destroy anybody who deviated, but in the Christian world at large, and now even in the political world at large. Does that make sense?
No, I think politicians have made it worse, though, right? Because they'll say things like, this is the most important election in the history of the republic, and if the other side wins, it'll be the end of America.
Yes.
I mean, that's what they said when Barack Obama won. And, we survived 8 years of Barack Obama. When Donald Trump won, we survived 4 years of Donald Trump, barely, but we survived. I mean, the republic is resilient, right? And these messages the thing is, it's people forget the fact that Republicans and Democrats used to be they just had differences in policy. They didn't hate each other. And now it's almost like we've demonized the other side in such a way that they're not just different, they're evil. And I think that is so
agree with you.
Caustic. It's just caustic to American discourse, and it's polarizing everything that we do. And unfortunately, the polarization makes everything worse because now we don't dialogue with people from the other side, so we don't see them as human beings. We depersonalize them and have created these sort of straw men out of the opposite side and not understanding who they really are.
And of course, the legislative sign of this is for the parties in Congress not to cooperate and compromise on legislation, but for each group to refuse to even vote for anything that comes up from the other party. And the Democrats feel like they have to have the majority vote with no Republicans. The Republicans feel like they have to have 100% of the Republicans and no Democrats so there's no collaboration even there.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's party discipline is all. You can't be a traitor to your party, right? We got you elected for a reason, so don't cross the aisle. Like, think it's like, for instance, universal background checks are supported by basically everybody. Like, even 75% of white evangelical Republicans support universal background checks for gun purchases in this country. Yet we don't. That bill would not pass Congress right now. Things like a pathway to citizenship, like the DREAM Act, is actually incredibly popular amongst basically everyone. There are policies that could pass right now that the American public would like. It's just for some odd reason, people in Washington feel like they can't vote with the other party because it makes them a traitor, makes them, you can't be a compromiser now.
I want to step back for a minute and get a wide angle lens on this church attendance, church participation issue.
Yeah.
You have tracked in your book, The Nuns, the decline of religious affiliation and religious participation. But is it not true that this is happening across the board in many, not just religious organizations, but many other kinds of health clubs, political parties, travel clubs, or, I'm thinking here about the famous book 20 years ago that you talked about in your book, Bowling Alone, where sports, even attendance at sporting events, high school sporting events, is on the decline.
Yeah.
Is this right?
Yeah, so there's some pretty compelling evidence that Americans are just less social creatures today than we were 20 or 30 years ago. And, the book that I talk about is called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, which is probably the best-selling political science book ever written. The subtitle is The Collapse and Revival of American Community, and it came out in the 90s. And what's funny is Putnam lays the blame for that decline in social capital on cable television, because that's when the book came out. It came out in the 90s when cable TV was really, proliferating across this country. But I think if Putnam was going to write version 2, it would be tweeting alone or Facebooking alone or Netflixing alone, or, whatever cable was, the internet has made that 10 times more exaggerated now. So it used to be you had to leave your house to socialize. You had to leave your house to be entertained, because you only had so limited options in your house to be entertained, because you only had 3 channels. You only had the radio or whatever it was. Now we literally have millions of ways to keep us entertained. So it's just easier to stay at home and not go out. And church used to be, and still is in some ways, resistant to that trend. But I think it can't be resistant all the way, right? You can't continue to fight against this wave of desocialization in America. I think a lot of what church has suffered from is just, it's another social organization. And so people are just doing less social stuff. And church has been, kind of swept up with the Moose Club and the Elks and the VFW Hall and all the social organizations that used to exist. People just don't do any of that anymore.
Well, I want to push back on that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a social scientist with my finger on all the data, but I wonder if one of the issues is not that people are doing less socializing, but that the socializing that we're doing is spread across many more kinds of things. When I was growing up, there were just very few things you could do as a kid. You could play in the band, and you could join the sports leagues at school, or you were going to church, Boy Scouts, maybe another. But now there are so many, I think about Comic-Con, things like this that did not even exist. Well, I don't even know where it got started, but I'd never heard of it. Mm-hmm. There's so many. There are these extreme sports, which there are travel things there, and some of them are online and some of them are not. Is it really true that we're less social, or is our social activity just spread out across more things?
Yeah, that's it. That's an interesting idea. For instance, I grew up playing video games. Nintendo and Sega and all those things were sort of getting big whenever I was a kid. So I played a lot of video games, but I sat in my room and played those video games by myself, right? Very socially isolated activity. My kids play video games that are all online now with their friends.
With their friends.
With their friends, right?
My grandson plays chess every day online. Has through the whole pandemic. And does this count as socializing?
So the evidence right now says that it is not equivalent one-to-one. Socializing online does not equal socializing in person.
Right.
And I think we all recognize that after COVID, right, after lockdowns and doing everything via Zoom, that Zoom meetings are a lot more draining emotionally than meeting someone in person, it feels like, right? There's something about this that depersonalizes the whole thing. And things like, even like on a Zoom meeting, you can't have like side conversation, right? You can't have like little banter before and after the meeting. It just seems so awkward and so forced. So, there's evidence that it's better than nothing, but it's surely not as good as the real authentic one-to-one thing.
Okay, so I'm going to push back on this.
Yeah.
I attend an online Sunday school class out of a church in Asheville, North Carolina. It starts at 9:45, but the Zoom starts 20 to 30 minutes earlier so people will have time to socialize. Second, we always use a chat bar so people can either communicate individually or with one another. And I'll have to confess here, I don't know whether other people do this or not, but the whole time I'm in my Sunday school class, I am texting with another member of the class. So, which is a level of communication, it's like the modern version of whispering, turning over to the person next to you around the circle and whispering while the teacher's trying to teach. Well, I'm sitting here texting, giving some ideas or commentaries or reaction to the teacher. I find this, this is a very compelling social engagement, and evidently because millions of people all over the country are doing this.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to stick though. I mean, I do speaking events. I used to do more speaking events, obviously, before COVID locked us down. And I think everybody I've talked to in terms of booking me to come do things, let's say like in October, November of this year,
right,
always is saying, we want you, if you are comfortable, to come in person. Sure. There's definitely, I think most event coordinators are saying, if we can make it happen in person, we will do it in person, because we realize the thing about the Zoom thing is, like, I teach, I'm still a professor, so I teach. I'm not teaching right now, but I taught in the fall, and I would teach a class online with 25 students, and I would look at a screen of black squares because they would all turn their cameras off. So I don't know what in the world they were even doing on the other side of the camera. They might have been playing video games or talking to their friends or, in the other room, and I wouldn't even know it. And let me tell you, teaching to a screen of black squares is probably one of the most demoralizing experiences of my life.
I can understand that. I'm surprised you couldn't require them to show their face.
It can't, because what if they have kids at home? What if they're in a public place? There's all these requirements. Like, what if they had to go work? There's all these things that we have to be very, the thing about COVID for us was our whole approach was to be graceful and flexible with them and their circumstances. Right? Understanding that they have all kinds of different needs at home. And so to require them to turn their cameras on is sort of to maybe expose people who don't want to be exposed. Maybe they live in a bad condition, right? Maybe they live in a hostile environment. So, it gets really complicated when
I understand. I understand. Yeah. Well, I'll have to confess that I'm getting ready to start an online Bible class. As a matter of fact, on April the 12th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, your time, I am going to pull together the first 20 interested people to talk about starting a Zoom class, Dr. Moody's Bible class. So you're telling me that maybe I've missed the wave of this, and I'm a year or two behind.
You know what, though? I think there's a small group of people who really do, express your opinion, which is they really like the Zoom approach. And I do think you're going to have more success, because if they opt in, listen, nobody opts into taking my class. They take it because they want to get a degree.
Oh, that's not true. They probably stand in line, have to get up early, like getting tickets to a Kentucky ball game.
I wish that was the case, but a lot of them
camp out. Come on, Ryan.
Well, yeah, but no, like some of them, I will say some of them are there because they want to have a class with me, but a lot of them are there just because they want to get through college, right? So, having an all volunteer situation, I think would get a lot more uptick, like a lot more people turning their cameras on and doing the right thing. But I think the reality is if I'll never have to teach on Zoom again, will be a great day. I told people, I go, if this is what we're going to do going forward, like we're going to teach on Zoom as our careers, I will quit and go do something else. Because it's just so soul crushing for me.
Well, I've interviewed a lot of pastors over the last year through the pandemic, and there's a lot of anxiety from ministers on the other side of what you're talking about. I'm sure business people feel the same way. They're not sure people are going to come back. Mm-hmm. They've gotten used to watching the church service in their pajamas or ordering from Amazon. But you seem to think people are ready to get out and come back and see people face to face and shake hands.
So, Mike, I think our experience at my church is sort of instructive of what we have to look forward to, and that is we started going back in person about a month ago. My church is about 15 people, and they're all old, like 75 years and up.
That's not old. That's not nearly as old as you think it is, Ryan. Be careful. I just had my 71st birthday like 2 days ago.
I got 90. I got several 90-year-olds in my congregation, and by any stretch, that is
old. Yeah, I guess
old.
It is.
You can't get away from that. But what's interesting was when we came back, there were 11 of us the first day, and we had a couple people who were good, faithful attenders before, but weren't back. And so I asked, of the 11 that were there, myself being one of them, how many had been vaccinated? And 9 out of 11 had been vaccinated. I hadn't because I wasn't eligible. And now I am vaccinated, by the way. So we've had Sundays now where we've had 10 or 12 people, and all but one of us have been vaccinated. And now we're getting some of the reluctant people who had already been vaccinated, but were just reluctant to go back into crowds, are coming back too. So I think it's going to be a slow climb. A lot of people came rushing back because they really wanted to be back. But I think other people who had, like, let's say, medical problems, let's say a history of cancer, things like that, were going to be more reluctant and need more reassurance that things are going to be better. So I don't think we're going to get back to like that pre-pandemic level of attendance, maybe ever, but it's certainly not going to be in the next month or two. It's going to be, let's say, September, October, when the pandemic largely is behind us.
Well, it not only is today Maundy Thursday and the beginning of all of this series of gatherings for Christians, it's also, I believe, the opening day of baseball.
Amen.
And so it's not just church people and church leaders who are going to watch very carefully how eager people are to congregate. It's the baseball owners and the people who run golf clubs and all sorts of civic organizations. So it's going to be interesting to see how the world comes out of this pandemic. Ryan, it's been great talking to you. This is such a fascinating subject about the American religious landscape. I'm very interested in it. I've had several shows on it. I've, of course, read your book and reviewed it. People can read my review online at themeetinghouse.net, where you can go and sign up for my newsletter each week. I send it out at 8:30 each Wednesday evening. That's Eastern Standard Time. And my recent newsletter does contain my review of this wonderful little book. This is the kind of book that church reading groups and Sunday school classes would be wise to pick up and read. Thank you, Ryan. You'll have to come back sometime in the Meeting House, and we'll talk about more of this research that you are involved in. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dwight. I really appreciate it.
I'll be back in just a minute with my commentary. I'm ready for Easter. I'm ready for Easter. I know they tell us not to overlook Good Friday, but I feel like we've been stuck on Friday for more than a year. I've had enough of all that Friday represents: depression and disruption and defeat and death, isolation, loss and grief, all of these things that we associate even with what we call Good Friday. Yes, this year of Fridays has had some bright spots for the country, for the community in which I live, where Ahmaud Arbery was murdered last February, and yes, for even my work here on the radio show, which I launched right in the middle of this year of Fridays. But mostly, I'm glad it's over. I'm ready for Easter and sunshine and flowers, choirs, and that great story. How on the first day of the week, the women came to the tomb and discovered it empty. How later the men came and found it empty. And then how Jesus came and found that small band of believers gathered in seclusion, stunned, disoriented, even disbelieving. I want to hear that whole story again, every piece of it. That familiar narrative, the memorable language, the surprising turn of events. I want the preachers everywhere to just tell that story. Tell all of it or part of it. No need to moralize about it or moralize or speculate, theologize about it. That's the word I want to say. What we need to do is to hear it in word and song, that story. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell some version of the story. Just pick a version and tell it. I like Matthew's story of the angel. Quote, his appearance was like lightning and his garment as white as snow, end quote. I like John's story of the foot race. Quote, and the other disciple ran faster than Peter and came to the tomb first, end quote. Tell one, tell them both. And if that's not for a sermon, tell them again. I'm reminded of the story about Billy Graham's first sermon. It was an Easter sermon, 1948. He was a teenager, 19 years old, I think. He brought with him 4 sermons, memorized, each of them 45 minutes long, 4 of them. When he got up to preach, he went through all 4 sermons in 8 minutes. Which reminds me, that Pope Francis has told all of his preachers around the world that 8 minutes is just about right for a sermon. Mark's gospel is a summary of Peter's preaching about Jesus. It's the shortest. But what is better than the reaction of the 3 women who were first at the tomb and first to hear the words? Dr. Burge has already told us that he's taking this as a text on Sunday. Quote, they fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid, end quote. I'll have to confess that's what I want to be this Easter. Astonished. Yes, a little fearful, even trembling. I want the good news of Easter Sunday at the end of a long, hard Friday to grip me again, to astonish me, to set me to trembling inside and out, to overwhelm me. Yes, I want to quit talking and once again listen to the stories of that eventful day some 2,000 years ago. Yes, there have been some astonishing things this past year, and there's some astonishing things in the Bible. But the early disciples, apostles, and preachers were right about this. At the top of any list of astonishing things is this great mystery. This Jesus, whom you crucified, God raised from the dead. That's the way preachers, teachers, and friends have been putting it for all the weeks since then. That's the way for an Easter sermon and song to put it for those of us who have heard it for 71 years, and for some people who will hear it for the first time this Sunday. I'm glad it's Easter, aren't you? You're in the Meeting House with me, your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody. I've been broadcasting from my studio in the mountains or the foothills of Western North Carolina. Thank you for listening or watching today. I'd like to hear from you. At the bottom of every page on our website at themeetinghouse.net, there is a response form. Just shoot me an email that you were listening, or a text, or post it on Facebook. You can subscribe to the newsletter. You can watch all of the podcasts. Every show we do becomes a podcast. And by Saturday, this one will be up as an audio podcast. As I said a few minutes ago, I'm launching a Bible class. Some of you might be interested. Some of you are listening around the country and have indicated to me over the last few months, as I've kind of felt this out, that you might be interested in being part of this. I'm trying to recruit 20 people who will join me for a conversation about this on Monday, the 12th of April. Monday, the 12th of April at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. That's, I think, 5 o'clock out on the West Coast. If you'll send me an email, go to the website and go to that response form at the bottom and just tell me that you're interested in this, I will take your email address and add it to my distribution and send you a Zoom link, and we'll get on and talk about it and set the parameters and see what the group thinks about it. You might want to join our Circle of 70. Beginning in December, I began to solicit some financial support to help pay for both the radio and the television and the cost of equipment. We have what we call the Circle of 70. 70 people. I chose that number because I was 70 years old at the time. I'm now 71. Maybe I should raise it to 71, but we're almost a third of the way there. We, I think, have 22 donors now. We need your help. And we encourage you to go online on our support page, and you can give online or you can send a check, and all the information is right there, the address where you can send it. I want to thank you for listening today. I'm always interested in what you think. If you've got ideas about what we can do, a program, somebody that we need to interview, a book I need to read, or a song we need to play, let me know. We're coming to you over rejoice975.com, the network, which is 97.5 FM and 94.7 FM down in Glenn County, Georgia, where my home is. But we're also being distributed on ssclive.tv through Facebook Live. Thanks to engineer Everett Armstrong in the studio in Georgia, Alex Mattingly in the studio in Louisville. Thanks to my guest, Dr. Ryan Burge of Eastern Illinois University. Thanks to all of you for listening today. You can follow me on Twitter at Dwight A. Moody. I'm up to 403 this week. That's one more than last week. Until next week, be safe, do justice, love mercy, wash your hands, wear a mask. Even though I've been vaccinated, I'm wearing mine. Drink some coffee and order some coffee from perfectocoffeeinc.com. Send a donation. Pray for the soul of our country. Be kind to everyone. In the Meeting House, I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.